Welcome back to Small Talk with the Lees. My name is Brandon, and I'm joined by Justin, Alejandro, and Andre. And we're discussing the CES letter today. This is part two, and this is going to be our testimony as well as some background and how we became the Mormons that we are today. Now, as you listen to this episode, you'll notice that we're all at different places and we all have different perspectives across the board. For example, Andre's a little bit more suspicious of what Jeremy Runnell has to say and his intent. On the other hand, I'm pretty open to whatever's being argued in the letter because I think there's some good arguments in there. I think this episode will be valuable as you kind of get our perspective on how we're dealing with the data points, and I hope you find it refreshing to see that there's multiple different views on this issue. So.
There's a voice that's buried deep inside my head. As it stumbled out, it said, hey, I got another chance. I was living like a zombie, head in a trance. Hey, and we're slow, and life is all you know, and then it flashed before my eyes. I realized this is everything.
So maybe Justin, if you can expand first, what is your take on this? What perspective are you coming at this letter from? Maybe just a little bit, you don't need to go into all the details, because we can do that in another podcast, but kind of the history of yourself, of Justin, and how he came to this kind of view and why that helped you deal with this letter when you read it, which is not going to be like the same as someone reading this who has no information about the issues.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point to start. And I'm not going to dive in really deep. And I don't know a lot about LDS history. I don't consider myself a history junkie where I'll just read like pioneer records and stuff. But I would say, like, I don't want, because I know there may be some people that are really well read with that, and they would have a lot of pushback for what I would say. So, and that's fine. I think that's great. And I would love to hear it at a different time. I'll basically say from my perspective, I grew up in a generally quite an orthodox family within the LDS church, and I always had this concern. I always remember asking my mom, well, because she would always say, if you just pray about the church, you'll know it's true. But I said, but why don't I just like pray about like Buddha, or why don't I pray about like Catholic, and I would also be able to have that same true feeling? And how am I not like kind of tricking myself? And she said, and she didn't really have a satisfactory response, because, and fair enough, I don't think a lot of people would know how to answer that, because faith is something much deeper than that. And so I always had that lingering question. And then people would say, oh, like when I was in youth, hey, just bear your testimony. And when you feel that feeling, that's the Spirit testifying to you. So, I mean, I would say I legitimately tried to go through those motions to feel those things. I would feel like, the goosebumps a little bit when someone was really passionate or getting really emotional about their testimony, but nothing to the extent where I was like, oh yeah, that's the Holy Spirit. I was just more like, well, I feel that when I watch like some really really emotional videos, or I felt that when I read this book that I think when I read this book called Redwall. It's about like these mice that fight each other in the house. And I was sad when one of the characters died, and I felt that same type of feeling when they kind of avenged the death of their comrade that was in arms. And I was like, I don't know, like I'm feeling these similar things. So I would say I went through this sequence of hearing all of these things, and I wasn't really sure. I wasn't someone that really felt like I gained a very strong witness, even though I tried to read and I tried to pray about these things. But I went on my mission anyways, nonetheless, and I would go and I was told, if you just believe it, by bearing your testimony, you'll gain your testimony. So I did that. I went and told people that I knew the church was true, that these stories are true, that Joseph Smith is a true prophet, that this is the one true church and it is restored. And I would say over time, as I said this, it felt like some power as I would bear my testimony to people on the streets about the first vision in particular. I would feel like this passionate feeling in my heart, this burning feeling, and I felt like, oh, that is quite that's a nice feeling, and I started to associate that with the Spirit. but then I came back for a mission. I tried to keep those things up, try to keep reading and stuff, and I did a pretty good job. But I think over time it began to feel like, that it didn't feel as strongly like it I felt like I was reverting back to those past questions that I had, even though I was doing my best to do that, to really figure out, okay, I really want to know whether or not this is the truth, whether or not this is going to actually improve my life. And I felt like to that point, it really did do that, because the mission taught me to be disciplined, it taught me to finish things, et cetera, et cetera. So I started to explore, I guess, and in terms of intellectually. So I started to look at different, political ideas, different philosophical ideas and stuff. And I would say initially that kind of filled my mind with a lot of things that made me question a lot of my fundamental beliefs, or maybe question a lot of the ideas that I had within the LDS church, such as the word of wisdom. Like, why do I not drink coffee? Why do I not do these things? Or why is there this seeming contradiction in the Adam and Eve story, where God tells them to not partake of the fruit, but then he gives them the fruit and tells them to, you know, multiply and replenish the earth. So there's a lot of these questions, and they started to build up. And I just was at a point where I wasn't really sure. I was like, I'm not sure what I do believe, and these things all seem to be very confusing. I've tried to just not question things. I tried to, block things out of my head, but it doesn't work. It always seems to come back, and you seem to have to inevitably face these questions in the end. So I think I went through a period of time while I was in college where I was thinking, I can pretend to I can try to just like, just dump it, like leave the church, and because it doesn't make any sense to me, or I can stay and be patient. And what it came down to was that I decided at that point that I don't know enough to rip myself out of a community, out of a group of people that had been my whole life, that had contributed to my whole life experience and my values and my culture. And a lot of that tradition is very important. And I could see the pragmatic fruits coming out of that culture, that it had a lot of benefits from it. So I kind of just, I was patient. I said, Justin, answers come slowly. And I didn't really make any brash decisions. So then I just kept doing what I always did. And as I was doing that, I came across Jordan Peterson eventually. And I don't want to make Jordan Peterson sound like he's some type of prophet that saved me, but Jordan Peterson had such a interesting, nuanced view on how to approach these religious questions. And Jordan Peterson, also another guy named Jonathan Pageau, and some of these other religious scholars, they talked about religion in a way that could appeal to someone with a rational secular mind. And I don't say that I'm someone that's super secular or rational, but it appealed to those questions that I had and answered them with a sufficient answer that I was like, okay, I can start to make sense of these, of how before I took these things so literally, but now from this symbolic approach, how it's kind of a new paradigm, a new worldview. And we can get into all that later, but that really started to be kind of the catalyst. So I would say that was around end of 2016 or something, and where I started to really reframe a lot of the ways that I approached my faith. And that, I would say, was the biggest saver. And I've begun to see a lot of the beautiful aspects of the LDS theology, and essentially moved to this new framework of how I approach faithful living and the LDS church.
So what
And
year did you
yeah,
finish your mission?
I finished. What did I finish? I finished in 2015.
Okay,
So
so
it
about
was
one
probably
year
about,
later.
it was about two. I think it was because end of 20. It was about a year and a half later, I would say, or maybe it was 20, a year and a half or 2 years. That's when I started to really kind of have this different approach. And I mean,
Okay.
that was not a long time, but I would say I was patient enough, because there was times where I was like, this doesn't, it just wasn't clicking with me. But I was like, I just
Mhm.
kind of need to
Right. And,
take it a day at a
and
time.
that's about the time frame I would say most returned missionaries would either probably just go inactive or leave the
Yeah.
church or do something around that. But so that's why I think the most important issue that we're trying to address here in the CES letter is not that you have to think a certain way after reading the CES letter, but that there are a multitude of different ways to approach theology, religion, and Mormonism after reading this letter. And so that would be one example, is your great story that you shared there. So thank you for sharing that, Justin. Alejandro.
Yeah, sorry if it was a little long, but anyways.
I think it was helpful to anyone listening. They probably want a background, or they won't understand where we're coming at this from. So go ahead, Alejandro. Your kind of perspective, your approach on this.
Okay, yeah. So just a little bit of background on me. I was very interested in anti-Mormon literature when I was a teenager. So when I was 13, 14,
Gasp.
15, I know, I would, I had the internet, and I would look into things, and I love controversy and drama, probably because I'm Latino, but I would look things up, and at the time in like early 2000s, the majority of the anti-Mormon literature at the time was written by evangelicals and Protestants, and sort of
like the God Makers or whatever. Have you read that
yeah,
letter?
exactly.
The God
Yeah.
Makers.
The God Makers. Yeah, that I remember watching clips of that, and of course, that was sort of a response to the popularity of Mormonism that was rising through the past later half of the century, and in the early 2000s, we had the Mormon moment with Mitt Romney, and so I would read that stuff, and my parents would say like, "Hey, man, like you shouldn't read that." My mom was like super strict, like, "Don't read that stuff," and my dad was, he said, "Hey, be cautious. If you're gonna read that stuff, you should at least read all the standard works and first." And like I tried, but they were kind of boring to my 15-year-old brain, and but I kept reading these things, and I heard a bunch of arguments about why the church was false or why it was incoherent, and it was really interesting. And I would approach my dad with these questions, and he would say, "Oh, yeah, this is my answer to it," or "This was my his thoughts about it." He never ever told me, "Oh, this is anti-Mormon." Let's say, for example, okay, obviously the sources were anti-Mormon, but if I would pull something that was like straight from the DNC or from, let's say, Rob Stone Rolling or an official church source, because a lot of these topics have been floating around for a long time, and you come across them in the Ensign every now and then. And so I would ask my dad about this, and he would say, okay, first he would never say this is anti-Mormon stuff, don't believe it. He would always say, oh yeah, this is my opinion, let's talk about this. Yes, this is true. What this means is, and then he'd give his opinion, or he'd say, I don't know. And so my dad really fostered like a place in my home where we could like openly discuss these topics. And then I was a pretty faithful Mormon for the majority of my time through high school. The majority of my friends were actually not LDS, which is interesting, I guess.
And you
'cause
grew
I
up
lived
in
in Utah.
Oh, you live in Utah. Okay.
Yeah, so the majority of my friends were actually atheists, and we were all musicians, so we would play in bands together and stuff. But so they would, of course, have questions, or they'd push back against my beliefs, and I would have to provide some sort of answer for them. And some of them made sense, and some of them didn't. I did the best that I could. I went on my mission in Tampa. Tampa is part of the Bible Belt, and so I had a pretty positive time, except for a few weird things with my mission president, and so that portion of my life was really interesting because I saw how positive the church could be, but then I also saw how negative, like, church leaders could be. And my mission president was kind of like this guy who put a wrench in like what I thought a mission president was and could be, and what the leadership was like, and I was just very kind of shocked. And he did a lot of things that we felt were sort of just not what a mission president should do. Even church headquarters had to get involved regarding his behavior. It wasn't to be. I don't want anyone drawing any wrong conclusions. He didn't do anything like sexually abusive or physically abusive. He was just like a really mean person. Anyways, so that I saw that shook a lot of people's faith within my mission. I knew people who were recent converts who had left the church because of things like that. Even companions that I had left the church because of what he did. And then once I came home, the whole Kate Kelly thing happened and the John Dehlin thing happened. And so it seems, from my perspective, questions about the church and anti-Mormonism, let's say, or church critics have always been part of like my spiritual experience. And then in 2016, I feel like everything happened for everyone this year. In 2016, my dad passed away unexpectedly, and that's the thing that really made, I don't know if I'd call it a faith crisis, but it really made me reconsider a lot of things. And then when I would go to church, I would go to Singles Ward in Orem, and I would hear people talk about the gospel, and I just didn't understand what they were saying. Everything was like, it was sort of like gibberish, like incoherent, like it just didn't make sense. Like point A didn't connect to point B very well.
Mhm.
And I was really trying hard to make sense of like, what are these guys trying to say? It doesn't like it, this is not addressing my needs as spiritually or emotionally, and I was really confused as to what the heck was going on. And it was at that point where I saw like, okay, I was kind of like at the like looking into the abyss, like, okay, there's a pivotal point here where I can disregard this because of how incoherent it sounds, or I can do something to make this make more sense. Because if it doesn't make sense to me, it's not making sense to others, and I feel like it would be doing everyone else a disservice if I were to just walk away. Whereas if I can make it make sense, then I could probably help someone along the way. And so I started reading more books, and again, that's sort of when Jordan Peterson came to prominence, and I started listening to him too. Um, I heard about him through his like political scandal in Canada, but at the time he didn't release his Bible lectures, but and I didn't read his Maps and Meaning book at the time. I started with his personality course, where he just talked about philosophers and personality, and just the quality of education that he was bringing to the table. Just the way he approaches intellectual problems, whether they be secular problems, psychological problems, or even religious problems, he would do it in such an open-minded, nuanced way, where he's not a black and white thinker, and so he didn't directly address any issues I had with the church or with my personal faith development, but just the way he would approach a problem was inspiring to me, and I thought, well, I'm going to try to imitate that anytime I have a problem. And so uh, I learned one of the things that I learned, and this now I'm going to get into like my impression of the CES letter. One of the things that I learned was, psychologically speaking, there's a frame through which you perceive information and you perceive what's relevant. And my perspective of, or my impression of the CES letter was, reading the CES letter, the whole 138 pages. I have one big beef with it, and then I'll tell you what the next thing. The big beef I have with it is, if you go to the resource or to the reference, the works cited portion of it, he cites Wikipedia about 67 times, and there's about 138 pages. So about half of, like, every other page, a citation is to Wikipedia. And so if I were to turn that into a college professor, I would get an F just right off the bat.
Yes.
So the point I'm trying to get at is, this document is not like an academic document. It's not. It doesn't have that rigor like a scientific journal or a published journal. This guy, as far as I can tell, he's doing sort of like the best he can with what he's discovered and what he's exploring. And so I'm going to I'm going to try and be as charitable as possible with Jeremy Reynolds, but right off the bat, like, this is not like a super rigorous document. And granted, he's doing the best he can. So my impression of the letter was, reading the letter was kind of like looking at those connect the dot books where you have like a coloring book and you connect the dots, then you color it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when you take it in as a whole, it looks like a connect the dot image where you can kind of make out the image, but the dots aren't connected, and then as you as you zoom in closer and closer, you start to notice the distance between the points that he makes. And then he also has a lot of like emotional and like passionate uh, parts throughout the book, and that sort of colors the image. And so I can see why this letter is really effective. It actually, there's a lot of brain power that the reader has to put into it to connect the dots, because each section that this guy writes, he brings up a bunch of points and then he asks a bunch of questions. Why would this? Why would this? And he actually doesn't make very many arguments, and so he sort of allows the reader to connect the dots. And I think he did that because he's really doing the best he can, and he's trying to be open-minded about this. But also, I think he's doing this because if we were to say, well, I don't agree with this conclusion that he's insinuating, he could easily just say, well, I never made the argument, and that's true. He doesn't really make the argument. He sort of just places the dots there, and he allows the reader to use their frame of reference to connect the dots. And so that was my overall impression of the CES letter.
Awesome. Great story, Alejandro. I appreciate it. And I have to agree with you on that last point. Like, I don't think the CES letter is effective or a good letter because it's like some scholarly material. I've actually seen other kind of compilations of all the problems with Mormonism, and they typically just bore you to death because they're just listed there, like on the page. But reading through this document is like, it makes jokes, it cracks humor. There's humor everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it keeps you interested in reading, and it has to do that because it's 138 pages long. And so that's actually one of the more effective things. It has a lot of emotional appeal to it. But at the same time, yeah. So that allows us to give more rigorous analysis on it in this podcast.
And I think to keep in mind that people could, like, just for those listening, you could read this letter, and if you're already kind of having reservations about the church and doubts and stuff, you could very well come to a conclusion that is not the most favorable to the church, you know. So, and those that are very, you know, more faithful reading this, they're going to interpret Joseph Smith's character in the light most favorable to him. So I think it's important to kind of keep that balance. Like, yes, we can interpret it in the light most favorable, or we can try to interpret it in the light most disfavorable to him. So there's a lot of room for how this would appeal to those depending on where they are in their faith journey.
Perfect. So I'm going to give a little bit of perspective now on my end. Okay. So first, disclaimers. I liked everything that Alejandro and Justin said. I can relate to, and I appreciate what they said. It's very similar to what I've kind of experienced. So first disclaimer is also, I'm not like an apologetic person. So I don't have all of the information. I don't have all the arguments, the nuance. I know people do have that, and that is perfectly fine, just as Justin said. And so if there's any pushback you want to give, please leave a comment below, and we will read it and take it into consideration. Now, that being said, you know, my career is not in church history, so I don't have all the time in the world to study these things.
What? You're supposed to be doing that on Sundays.
Right. I wish I could, but sometimes, you know, I don't want to read through the Pioneer journals. It's just too much information. So there's only so much stuff you can read. So I get it when people say they don't want to read this or they don't want to read that. But when it comes to the CES letter, I think this is a very foundational document in that it compiles the main arguments, and they have to be addressed in some way or another. So, okay, a little bit of background on me. So I think if you want to understand where I'm coming at this perspective, I would quote Sterling McMurrin. And he says that he doesn't see churches as true or false. He sees them as either good or bad in what they do. And so I share that similar perspective. As I was reading through this document, I'm trying to look at, I think, this whole debate, and the reason why I'm so reluctant to actually put out this podcast is because I see belief and value systems as, in this weird way, I don't know if it's a necessary connection, but it's connected to kind of the way we act as a human. So basically what I mean by that is, growing up and being born into this church and raised as a member, I have kind of intuitions, I have reactions that are ingrained inside of me due to Mormonism. Like, I've been ingrained when I see somebody smoking or drinking to think like, oh, that's bad. Okay. And, it's not necessarily that it has to be that intuition that you feel, but that's how I am programmed to feel. So I kind of see this deep link between beliefs and actions. And at the same time, I'm also a very intellectual person. So I like discussing arguments. I like having these abstract debates and stuff. And I've always liked that to the most part. I've been really interested in philosophy. But I want to put like an even bigger perspective on this entire subject. And that is, I guess, to quote Brigham Young in the Journal of Discourses, he basically says, even if Joseph Smith was a liar and he slept with other people's women and he is a fraud, the work that he has produced has been a work of salvation. And, I might not even take what that quote says literally. And I kind of think of everything as religion as a tool for me to become the best kind of person I can become. And this kind of stated in religious terms as the human potential, born in the image of God. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I get it. Like, not everyone's going to like that. There's going to be a lot of pushback. There's a lot of interesting questions. Once you have this view, like, what does priesthood mean? What does all these stuff mean? And that is open for discussion. And that's why I can't limit myself to this one podcast series. And that's my message kind of to the world, is that, I don't want you to get caught up in all the details here, even though we're going to dive straight into the details. Because to me, that's not what religion is about. It's about being a good person. Okay.
Can I add to that really quickly before you
Sure.
continue?
Go ahead.
I really like what you just said about religion being sort of like a thing that makes you a good person. I think one of the things, if you want to really understand the author, is, he brings a lot of cultural assumptions to the table, culturally within Mormonism and culturally just within modernity and living in the West in the 21st century. And so things like reducing religious belief to like agreement with propositional statements is sort of how we all look at religion, and that's why this document, I think, is very effective, because it takes a lot of the propositions, like, he sort of frames this as like, if you agree with these things and you are a believer and you're a Christian and you're a Mormon, and if you disagree with these statements, then you're not. And then people feel like they have like this choice that they have to make, and that's like, statements of belief is an important aspect of religiosity, but like you said, it's not the total picture. It's not the entire thing. There's like a behavioral aspect and a pragmatic aspect, and a sort of like a self-transcending aspect to it.
Perfect, Alejandro. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, well, I was just gonna say this document focuses more on the propositional type stuff and maybe like the hard truth claims, and then, but that's not all there is to Mormonism. So.
And okay, thank you, Andre. Also, welcome. We have another guest joining us.
Andre,
Thank
all the
you.
way
Hey, how's it
from
going, guys? What's up?
Spain.
All the way
I
from
know.
Ronda, Spain.
Calling in 8 hours difference here.
This is our famous Egyptologist. He can read hieroglyphs and write them.
Reformed Egyptian.
I
Perfect.
know.
So we got 4 experts here. So we're just talking about our
What did I
perspective.
miss?
Right now we're going through our take on the CES letter, so we give some background information to the listeners. We kind of want them to get a feel of what our type of Mormonism is and how we're approaching this letter. So I'm going to go, and then we'll let Andre go right after, okay?
It's all
Good.
Okay, so to give a little bit background for me, and I'm going to get into what Alejandro said about belief, okay? So, yeah, kind of like Alejandro's family, like, I was always kind of taught, like, not really in the family, I think more so in the congregation, in the church, but, don't go looking for outside sources, stick within LDS.org and stick within the standard works. And so I've always kind of had this pressure, like, oh, you shouldn't look at what they would term anti-Mormon sources. And to me, that just never really made sense, because I'm a very philosophical minded guy. So I kind of like to think of things as arguments. I separate the arguments from the person. So anytime someone says something, I try my hardest not to do any ad hominem attacks or like, you know, if someone's arguing about abortion, I don't say things like, well, you're a man, so you wouldn't understand it. I try to isolate aspects of things. And so I can read these documents and I don't care if it's anti-Mormon or not, from the perspective of the author, right? Jeremy Reynolds makes no pretenses. He says straight up front, he says, I'm coming from this from an anti-perspective. I'm not going to pretend about this. And so I don't worry about those kind of things because I kind of like to analyze things on a line by line basis. And so that's kind of always been a fundamental part of my way of thinking, is that I like to deal with kind of the claims and whether they're accurate or not. And so reading this document, you know, it's really interesting for me. Like you said, he just puts the dots out there and he kind of leads the reader into connect it. For me, whenever I see these kind of documents, I don't care if the dots have to be connected in this way according to the author. I just like to look at these data points and then kind of connect them in my own way. So going off of that, I've never been afraid to kind of delve into these issues. I've been reading so kind of to stay within the framework of Mormonism, though. When I was like 10 years old or something, really young age, I would read the BYU educational manuals. So basically what that is there's 4 standard works, right? The Bible, the New Testament, the Book of Mormon, and then the Doctrine and Covenants that it would go through. I get it, Pearl of Great Price is also in there. But these 4 manuals were commentaries on kind of weird things. So like when you get to Elijah and the bears, you know, you'd read that and you'd be like, what the heck? So you'd open up this manual and you kind of see I don't know who wrote these manuals, but it's for the BYU religion courses. And they'd say, okay, so what's actually going on here? And then they'd make a bunch of they would make you play mental gymnastics. They'd make all these things like, okay, well, actually the soldiers are not young people. They're not kids. They're actually soldiers. So they're old. You know, the bears are maybe like, these are mama bears. The soldiers were actually like killing their kids. You know, it would kind of go through all these types of arguments. So from a very young age, I've been examining weird things, you know, instead of just putting on my shelf. You know, I kind of like to look at these arguments like, okay, well, what do the apologists say? And so I've kind of approached these kind of what other people would term anti-Mormon questions, but I've always looked at it from these faithful sources. So I've been familiar with the issues. I know how people kind of address them. And so that's why diving into this document was not like a concern for me, while for most people it probably would be, because they're taught not to read anything outside of LDS.org or not to trust anything.
Yeah. I mean, I even had I had a friend that she said, oh, if you want to stay in the church, you probably shouldn't read the CES letter. So I was like, all right. But yeah, I think there's definitely that. There have been a lot of people that have read it and their faith was, I guess, their paradigm was shattered. And
yeah, so I actually want to make that disclaimer. You know, I like to divide. Well, actually, I take this from Greg Prince. He divides up the church into 3 kind of main groups, and one of those groups is the ones that, you know, don't show me anything. You know, I have a great perspective right now. I have great testimony and faith, and I like it how I am at right now. And the second group is kind of those who are doubting, and they have a lot of questions and nothing's making sense to them. And you know, they don't know where to look for answers, because on the one hand, they're told don't go looking for answers. And on the other hand, they can't get answers through prayer or scriptures, is how they feel. And the third group, of course, is people who kind of have a different view on all of this and have a symbolic type sacramental paradigm. And I'll kind of explain that later. But if you are in that first group and you're listening to this and you feel uncomfortable and you want to turn it off at any time, I am not against it. Like, if you do not want to listen to this kind of stuff and you don't feel it is good for you, I am not against you not listening to our podcast. And so I just want to make that disclaimer. Like, I'm not out here to hurt anybody or to get at anybody's testimonies. My main point in doing this whole series is because I want to address that second group, and that is the people who would like to discuss these issues, who feel like they have no place, because there is no place in Sunday school, there's no place in gospel doctrine class, there's no place in sacrament meeting, there's no place really at all in the church structure to talk about these issues. And so those who are feeling uncomfortable, this is where I want to provide that forum. So that's kind of my disclaimer. And sorry, I'm winding around in circles here, but I want to go back to the part about evidence. And so if there's one word I wish every single person in Mormonism knew, that word would be epistemology. I actually watched a really cool Saints Unscripted video explaining epistemology. And it's the way that we come to know things, okay? So a lot of times you'll hear in testimony meeting in sacrament, which is the first Sunday of the month, you'll hear people get up on the stand and they'll say, I know that the church is true. I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I know this and I know that and this. And the question is, by what process does one come about knowing something? And so it's really funny in this video, he kind of explains to the people kind of how do they know? He asked them, how do you know the earth is round? And they kind of like give a few reasons, like, oh yeah, I was taught that in school, or oh, I've seen pictures from NASA, things like this. But they themselves firsthand have never witnessed any of these things. And then he basically tells them, like, so you don't actually know these things, right? You're just believing on other people's words. And they're like, oh. And then he's like, there, I just implanted your first faith crisis about the world being round. And so that's kind of, I think, epistemology. I think we really need to understand and be very nuanced when we use these words: know, belief, and faith. And so for me, there's this interesting topic coming around lately in Mormon circles, and it's mostly by Terrell Givens, who has this whole lecture series he had at BYU called The Choice to Believe. And I kind of feel like he's conflating the two words, belief and faith. And I would kind of link, so to describe this, there's this term, okay, it's really philosophical. It's called doxastic voluntarism. And it's this debate in philosophy whether or not you can choose to believe something or not. And so there's this psychology study or something like that. It's like, if I gave you $1 million, Alejandro or Andre or Justin, and I told you had to believe in Santa Claus, could you actually believe in Santa Claus? And the answer seems to be no, you cannot. And so there seems to be serious evidence, and within the philosophical debate, that you can't actually choose to believe what you believe.
Right.
You don't have a conscious choice over that. It's deep inside of you. It's ingrained. It's a mixture of your worldview. Your worldview is a mixture of your experiences and the pieces of evidence that you have seen. And although there's exceptions to this, like you can restrict the evidence that you see. You can only read flat earther material and then consciously, therefore, believe that the earth is flat. There's other exceptions, like you can, if you're trying to play a tennis game, you can believe that you're going to win, because belief that you're going to win is going to help you actually win the game. And so there's these few exceptions to this kind of doxastic involuntarism, where you can kind of control your environment and therefore control how you believe, but it's really hard to manipulate directly what you believe. So I say that in the background of reading this letter, talking about issues like this, people that want to leave, people that don't want to leave, people that want to believe, people that don't want to believe. I honestly think it's so hard to make judgments on people because of the involuntary nature of belief. That being said, there's a difference, I think, between belief and faith. And so this is kind of my perspective. Whether or not I believe something, I have no idea, to be honest. It is so, I believe it's very unconscious. Like we were having a discussion about whether or not you believe in the resurrection or not. And, it's like, well, if you actually did, would you be fine with getting martyred? It's like, how do you trust someone that talks the talk or that walks the walk? That's kind of the question here. And I see belief as kind of the talking points, and faith as kind of the action. And so action actually is a choice, I believe. I believe in free choice. I believe that you can have the choice over faith questions. And so I'll divide faith and belief questions. So things like, does God exist? Things like, should we, is Jesus Christ the ultimate example that we should emulate? I believe these are faith questions because they're metaphysical questions that we cannot analyze with our current scientific tools. On the other hand, we have belief questions such as, did Joseph Smith have 30-something wives? Or was Noah's Ark really a thing, like where they had all the animals on the ship and there's a global flood? We can analyze these things very specifically with archaeological tools, with historical evidence. And these are the kind of things that, I don't think people have control over. They have control over what they read. But once you read something, you don't have control over your belief. On the other hand, on these questions of whether God exists, on whether we should emulate Christ's example, these kind of questions are questions you cannot answer through science, and you must answer through faith, and you have a choice of whether you want to answer them in the terms of whether you act like God exists or you don't, whether you act like you're trying to emulate Christ's example or you don't. And so by separating these two types, belief and faith, I don't want to criminalize anyone who disbelieves or believes, but at the same time, I want to promote that you do have the choice over faithful questions, whether you want to be fidelity and trust, I think, is the best way to describe faith. Do you want to act in a way harmonious with your values or not? I think you totally have a choice with that. So that is kind of my spiel on a belief coming through this whole article, and why in the end, I don't think any of these things matter to me personally, although they may matter very much to you for these issues. But that's my direction of taking apart this article.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Brandon. And Andre, did you get a chance to read the CES letter, Andre?
You know what? I'm on probably like page 30. But I read some of the stuff on the CES, and then I was kind of curious. I took a detour. I read some Fair Mormon, and I was talking to Brandon yesterday, and I read quite a bit of the churchestrue.org. Is that what that is?
Yeah, churchestrue.com
is a great blog. I share a lot of the views in that blog. So if you're curious about this symbolic view or this sacramental paradigm, you can look up churchestrue.com. Great domain name, by the way.
Yeah, honest.
So yeah.
Did you want me? Yeah.
Why don't you kind of share with us the perspective that you're coming from?
Yeah, sure. So my perspective is pretty interesting. I've lived in kind of two separate households. My mom's household has been pretty faithful, almost like a very practicing every Sunday type Mormon teaching. And then my dad's household is more agnostic, I would say, more of not organized religion, more of there's been quite a few different philosophies and theologies that have been in my dad's. So it's been pretty interesting for me to kind of go through that, especially with authority figures, and kind of navigate my own way through it.
Interesting. So as you read this CES letter, I know you didn't read the whole thing, but those parts that you did read and stuff, what were, your initial reactions, objections, or concessions to it, or whatever you came across?
I try and take it in with a grain of salt. And part of the reason that I do this is because I've been exposed to a lot of anti-material throughout my life. And most of it has been pretty claims that have been dishonest, not genuine claims, right? Where so it makes me hesitant whenever I read anti-material that the questions aren't genuine.
Okay.
And so that was my kind of perspective going into it. So it's interesting, when I was younger, I was exposed to some material. I think in Brandon and I shared a teacher, Miss Lobb. She's awesome. And she asked us to read a book for her chemistry class. And so, I think she just wanted us to read any science book or any book that was of importance. And so I ended up reading Freakonomics by Stephen Levitt.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely loved the book.
Great book. Yeah.
So I didn't have a view on abortion, but after reading that, I was pro-choice. You know, my views were more pro-choice, not because of like women's uh, autonomy or anything like that, but because I felt that if society benefited from abortions and crime rate going down, then that was something that was good. And so my views have been really, you know, more utilitarian as I've kind of grown up, and I've seen that maybe sometimes utilitarian things aren't the moral things either. And so my my views have changed. I no longer think that, because um, you know, not just what's good for society is, if it's not good on the individual level, then I don't think that is something that should be practiced among society. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
you've
yeah, yeah.
had
So
evolving views on you're willing to cast out views and replace them with views you feel better. So kind of
definitely.
why how do you think that relates to Mormonism, the CES letter? What are you trying to get at here?
Perfect. Yeah, I've been through, like I told Brandon, when I was younger, I went through a lot of Protestant and kind of like Methodist preachers. I listened to a lot of what they thought, because I've always been in the search of truth. I've always loved the scriptures, and I've taken people that take the literal meaning of the Bible. And am I cutting out?
No,
No,
you're
you're
good.
good. And when we say
I'm good. Okay.
literal, we're talking about the seventh day, or not the seventh day, the 7 day creationist type literal, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have your young Earth and your old Earth,
Mhm.
and I mean, there's just a lot to look around there. So you know, I kind of went through there for a while, and I realized, you know, while I was going on my mission, I liked having a more conservative view. I liked tradition. I liked seeing things for their worth. So I try not to cast things out right away. I try to really look at them and see if they have worth. I think a quote that I've told Brandon before from one of Jeffrey R. Holland's talks, "The Inconvenient Messiah." One of my favorite
Uh-huh.
quotes is, uh, "No person is smart enough to cast out in one lifetime the traditions of centuries."
Hmm.
And I think that's really important, that we can't cast out those traditions right away. So the CES letter, I would really I love genuine questions, but my perspective going into the CES letter is this a genuine letter, right? Or
Yeah.
does it have malice in it, right? Is there you know, fiction thrown in along with the facts? So kind of what Brandon was saying, I wrote a couple notes down here. Brandon always quotes Jordan Peterson, right? He loves Jordan Peterson.
I do.
So
Prophet
you know,
Peterson, you mean? No, I'm just
pro-
kidding.
so Jordan Peterson says, act as if he acts as if God exists, which I
Uh-huh.
think is a complete waste of time, unless he does, right? And I think uh, a couple things on epistemology. So epistemology, a teacher can, you know, instruct their students true things, and just because, you know, the students didn't go and conduct the experiments themselves, they didn't have primary resources,
Yeah.
a secondary resource doesn't make it less true, you know. Because we weren't there when uh, you know, Joseph Smith received the vision, you know, Doctrine and Covenant 76 doesn't make it less true. Does that make sense? Because we're looking at secondary
Oh yeah. Okay.
Sure.
resources.
Okay, so you're kind of going through the letter. You're kind of sorting through the validity of these sources. Is that kind of how
Right.
I'm taking your take on it?
Right. And part of something that I see is that I agree. I, you know, I love science, I love numbers, and I think that we all look at similar, you know, we're looking at the same data, and we have different perspectives on it. You know, and some of them are you know, you can have a divine perspective towards something, whereas someone can discount that divine perspective. And I don't think that that science and religion, you know what I'm saying, I don't think that they're completely separate. I think that you can have, I think Brandon and I, we were talking about this, you can have religious experiences through science. Does that make sense? I think that God is a God of science, and
Yeah,
if
yeah, I
he
get
wants to do things,
I think I get
We
what
do
you're
them through
saying.
that way.
I mean, my view is that because you can have many data points, but someone interpreting the data points has a frame of reference that they're going to use to tell it,
Exactly.
right? So
Exactly.
I would say that from my perspective, science is subsumed by religion. It's nested in religion because religion gives it a narrative, a
Right.
meaning in which these
Definitely.
points are interpreted. So when you have a different worldview of, and you're taking these points, you can come to two totally different conclusions. And I think that's well documented that nothing is really neutral news. When someone says, I want to listen to a neutral news source, that's very hard to come by. I don't even think that's possible because when someone's reporting the news, they're going to be doing it through the frame of their narrative. So when you hear Ben Shapiro, he's always going to be using conservative values to interpret something, or his neoconservative values. When you hear someone like Rachel Maddox, she's going to be using her more progressive values to tell you the narrative. And it resonates with those people that hold those similar type of values. If you want just the facts, you go to Wikipedia and you read just the facts. But no one ever does that because it's boring and it doesn't stick into anyone's head. Because you need to have a narrative to frame your thinking to grab your attention.
And I pull my